As an anthropologist by training, I've been thinking about you as a tribal group, a tribe of social entrepreneurs. And I'm interested in understanding, who are your chiefs? Who are your shaman? What is your ideology? What are the myths that you hold in common? Everything that distinguishes you, what you eat, what is the music that moves you, is coming to the Skoll World Forum a rite of passage. What brings you back each year to this place to sit with others from all over the world with whom you share common values and perhaps common concerns. That's what I'm going to try and identify in my remarks. This is my 5th opportunity to do field work among you. As a participant observer at the Skoll World Forum, and because I was here as a student at New College and at the Institute of Social Anthropology, I feel I've been given the privilege of saying things that are not clearly based on scientific research. What I've chosen to say is drawn from my field notes and from very, very personal observations that are less about objective analysis and more about the result of a desire to understand what it is that makes a person like you decide to do a kind of work where the outcome is never assured. I'm interested in that strong likelihood that you will, in your work, deal with disruption. It will occur. And you will be required to utilize a combination of past experience, creativity, blind faith, and the courage required to see disruption as an opportunity for the pursuit of possibilities. My totally unscientific and unsubstantiated fieldwork observations, let's call them almost facts, about the lives and work of social entrepreneurs suggest the following. Number 1, you are correct, and you will have a better chance of sleeping through the night when you remember that everything is an experiment. Number 2, you do your best work when you don't try to create and analyze at the same time. They're different processes. 3, the great 20th century composer John Cage could have been speaking for you when he said, "I can't understand why people are frightened of new ideas. I'm frightened of the old ones." We are breaking all the rules, even our own rules. And 4, the smartest way to work is to not quite know what you're doing. This is often the way that great artists work, and also physicists and mathematicians and activists, embracing the unknown. 5, what is essential is that you educate your intuition and then trust it. The novelist Mark Halperin has come closest to describing what is required of the social entrepreneur. He said you must be willing to be obstinate and irrational and true, to fashion your entire life as a construct, a metaphor, a fiction, a device for the exercise of faith. And with this, you will stay in the fight until the very last. The fight becomes literal when you're faced with disruption. In that moment, all of your strategic planning, existing resources, alliances, and measurable outcomes are thrown into question, and there is no choice but to pursue new possibilities. The disruption may be the result of a change in government, an environmental disaster, the emergence of an unexpected tribal or religious faction, or all of the above. I learned my lessons on the subject in the Amazon forest, and the disruption I witnessed pushed me from being an Oxford-trained social anthropologist doing fieldwork in order to write an academic thesis on the ideology of a previously unstudied tribe of Indians into a world of activism that at that time could not have been further from my initial career goals or plan, the direction I had received from my Oxford tutors. The professor of anthropology at Oxford and the lecturers at the Institute of Social Anthropology cautioned me to introduce nothing to the tribal culture, to leave no trace, to tell the people nothing about our world, to be vigilant about exposing them to both new ideas and new diseases. I spent 2 years with a tribe called the Wausha, who lived in the Xingu River region of the Brazilian Mato Grosso. They were an isolated group of 100 people, living in a village of 6 thatched houses, hunting with bows and arrows, painting their bodies, and living under the leadership of a powerful chief, who every evening addressed the tribe on the subject he had been reflecting upon that day. It might be astronomy, the life cycle of a particular fish, or an interpretation of one of the scores of myths. The myth in question usually had direct application to the behavior of an individual or a family dynamic that had caught the chief's attention during the course of a day spent looking for food. The chief was the wisest person I had ever known, and I wanted very much to earn his respect. But I had been taught that the anthropologist would lose his credibility in the field if he became overly involved in the life of the people. I did understand that I was privileged to be studying one of the last totally self-sufficient tribal groups that for the most part had no real knowledge of Brazil. I was the first non-Indian to speak the Wausha language. When I arrived in the village, neither their language nor their mythology had ever been studied, had ever been recorded. In my first year of fieldwork, I was true to my training and my promise to not disrupt their isolation with material culture from the outside world. I took my field notes, recorded songs, collected myths, made kinship charts, began to imagine myself in the classroom, teaching anthropology to graduate students the way I had been taught, with intellectual rigor and absolutely no politics. I had malarial attacks, but that was a small price to pay for an Oxford D.Phil. I slept in a hammock in the chief's house, and his wife kept the fire going during the cold nights and shared the food collected during the day. Our diet was a soup made from manioc roots from which the poison had been extracted. Fish shot with bows and arrows from the prows of dugout canoes, edible insects, the occasional monkey, and during the rainy season, a diet almost entirely of a wild fruit that looked like a giant avocado. I lost 50 pounds in the first 6 months. Before the disruption that changed my life and that of the tribe, I had begun to feel rather proud of myself. I had avoided answering almost all the questions about my tribe. What did we eat? Who were my tribe's enemies? Would I teach them our tribal songs? Was my father a chief? Who was providing my mother with food while I was away from the village? The chief told me, people are defined by what they eat and by their music. After being asked 1,000 times to sing one of my tribe's songs, I broke down, and for reasons I still don't quite understand, sang the Yale University fight song. It was a great mistake. I then had to endure the embarrassment of a group of naked men painted blood red running down to the river for their morning bath, singing at the top of their lungs, "Bula bula, bula bula, bula bula, Eli Yale." About the same time, my informant, Tawapu, the man who had taught me to hunt jaguars and how to find turtle eggs buried in the banks of the river, and who had spent countless hours answering my questions about the tribe's kinship structure, began to call me by a nickname. The name seemed to please everyone in the tribe. This is very good, I thought. They like me. Nicknames are a sign of affection. I'm succeeding in not disrupting their lives, and they've come to accept my presence and perhaps understand, even value, my anthropological research. This was a breakthrough moment. And I had always known that Tawapu was very smart. Here was this man, in a pre-literate society in the middle of the Amazon forest, who had grasped the sophisticated concept of the objective observer, the analytic work of the social scientist. I told Tawapu, I am happy. Awushapaitia, I am happy to have been given a new name. And would you help me to translate it and understand its meaning? Yes, he said, Mutetsi. It's half a leech and half a parrot. Not too long after this humbling moment, I came to realize that my intrusion into the daily life of the tribe was nothing compared to what was heading directly for them. At this moment in time, the chief spoke no Portuguese and did not understand the concept of a country called Brazil. The tribe was not aware to what degree two men, Orlando and Claudio Villas-Boas, had been protecting them, how these brothers had somehow managed to delay the arrival in the region of diamond prospectors and rubber trappers, desperate men and women from a drought-stricken northeastern Brazil in search of land and food and survival. The Villas-Boas brothers had been campaigning in Brasilia and São Paulo to make the Xingu region a national park for indigenous people. They were well aware that in spite of the fact that the Brazilian Constitution provides ownership rights to native people as long as they remain on their ancestral lands, something bigger and more disruptive was now heading toward the Wausha tribe and the others in the region. No road had ever crossed Brazil, the vast forests, the rivers at the center of Brazil. No road. The first highway, the BR-80, BR-80, was now under construction, and unknown to the Indians, thousands of road workers and their massive machinery was heading directly towards them. What would follow is now what exists through much of the interior: agribusiness, cattle, timber, soybeans, rice, every possible revenue stream that would yield the most immediate and greatest return. Dynamite the trees if necessary, but open the land for multinational corporations who, once the Indians were gone, had acquired titles to it. We were walking through the forest, 100 people heading for the village of the Kalopalo, a neighboring tribe who had invited us to participate in the Kwarup ritual, wrestling tournament, dances, feasting, commemorating one of their chiefs. We were walking in single file, and I was carrying the chief's youngest grandson on my shoulders when we heard the sound of a plane. The Wausha called planes pahokuma, giant birds, and had often seen them flying high in the sky, but this time it was different. This plane was very low and very loud. It was just above the trees, and I recognized it was a small, older cargo plane with no markings. Not much later, we saw with our own eyes what the plane was carrying, its cargo. It was human and barely alive. A small number of totally naked, dazed, and weak adults. There was one baby and a small child. They were the last survivors of a fabled tribe known as the Beso de Pau. The absence of a common language did not stop the Wausha from understanding the story, which the survivors acted out in great detail. The Beso de Pau had experienced what is sometimes referred to as the fatal contact. They had been given gifts of food and blankets by strangers who arrived in their village. Within days, everyone was ill. The symptoms sounded like measles. Entire families perished. There was no one left in that part of the forest where they had lived for generations. As with the Wausha, these people had their own distinct language and no doubt a profound understanding of botanical medicine. Within their own culture, they had been oral historians, naturalists who required no written language. Their young people had known the name of every life cycle of every fish in the river, and they could identify every bird in the forest and were expected to take responsibility for younger siblings and to carry their own weight. They had survived for millennia because of their prowess, and because, like the Wausha, they believed that all food must be shared. No matter how small the amount had been gathered or hunted that day, it was understood that their children must be fed first. This brief encounter with the surviving Beso de Pau changed the course of my life, my sense of the work of anthropologists. My first impulse was to collect evidence of what I had just witnessed. And I still had the camera I had brought in my rucksack when I began my fieldwork, and by some miracle, it was still working, and I photographed the Beso de Pau survivors. Months later, I managed to get the film and a letter to Seymour Hersh at the New York Times. He published an article about the massacre of Indians in the Amazon. It was picked up by newspapers around the world and made headlines in Brazil. It was not until I left the forest that I learned that perhaps as many as 20 tribes had been targeted and were being systematically removed from their land to make room for development. I was ready to do just about anything to draw attention to the situation, to speak to anyone who could be helpful. I edited a book about the cultural heritage of the Xingu tribes and published it in Brazil and in the US. I tried to enlist the leaders of the anthropological field, including Margaret Mead, who was then the best known, the most famous of living anthropologists. She told me, give up. There's no hope. The Indians should be given motorboats, and they could earn a living working for the road workers. I wrote and appeared on my own program on BBC's Radio 4. The playwright Christopher Hampton heard a talk, a lecture I gave, and wrote a play called Savages that was produced at the Royal Court in London and then transferred to New York, California. I had the advantage of youth. I didn't know what I didn't know. And I went to speak with politicians and representatives and the United Nations and the heads of corporations and the governments directly involved in the development of the Amazon. I will never forget the high-ranking Brazilian official who proudly said, "The Amazon, that's our California. Where would the United States be today if you had left California for your Indians? We're just following your example." This was my true rite of passage, my loss of innocence. Being among you, being at the Skoll World Forum, makes me feel optimistic. Social entrepreneurs have what I would like to call a vocation. You are prepared to envision new alliances, new power structures, and to fight until the last for a more equitable and environmentally responsible world. And we all have our work cut out for us. And we all need to be able to turn disruption into opportunity. For the rest of the forum, I am going to be thinking about the women drummers, the women from Rwanda. And it must have sounded not only improbable, but impossible to achieve Ngoma Nisha, the new drum, the new era. The founder who you saw on this stage, Kiki Katezi, she told me that she had gone to the National Museum, to the head of the National Museum, and asked, "Is it actually forbidden for women to play the drum? Why has this never happened in Rwanda?" The answer she received was that it was not forbidden. In fact, there was no specific cultural prohibition. Perhaps it was because drums are heavy, and maybe women are not strong enough to hold and play a drum. To which Kiki had replied, "Let's just see how strong we are." I'm going to remember the sound of the drums and the answer and the question that we need to ask, that all of us need to ask. Let's ask it. Let's just see how strong we are. Thank you.